Well, welcome everyone. A very impressive showing on a really, really miserable evening, but for a spectacular, what will promise to be a very spectacular evening. My name is David Elwood. I'm the dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Before I introduce Congressman Barney Frank, I just want to thank the groups that helped sponsor this event, including the Institute of Politics, as well as the Kennedy School's Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, the Taubman Center for State and Local Government, as well as Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. Now, we have with us the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, which of course has just slightly been in the news of late. He is someone, though, that is not a Johnny-come-lately to this entire issue. Indeed, in many respects, he's the ideal person to be in the position he's in because he actually was a native of Bayonne, is that how you say it? Bayonne, New Jersey, my apologies, where he grew up helping to pump gas at his father's truck stop on the Jersey Turnpike. After that, he then went to Harvard College, and indeed he became involved here at the Institute of Politics. Indeed, I think we have a picture of when he was actually, if you'll see there, see that arrow up there? That's Barney Frank in 1966. Now, he was actually the first director of student programs at the Institute of Politics here. And one of his great claims to fame is, you may have recalled there in the 60s, not very many of you actually will recall, but in the 60s, there was a very major incident on Harvard's campus when Robert McNamara was asked to speak by actually a group at the Institute of Politics. And a throng of students built up. He was the Secretary of Defense at the time. It was the middle of the Vietnam War, very controversial. The Harvard students were threatening to riot. Nathan Pusey said, Harvard students don't riot. He was the president. Well, they almost did. So Barney Frank escorted Robert McNamara out of the steam pipe and into some safe place or vice versa. To Henry Kissinger's seminar. So there you go. And so right from the start, he's been involved. He's also been at the Harvard Law School. He's taught at the college and the Kennedy School. He has many, many connections. But Barney Frank was involved in politics really from an early age. Prior to his election to Congress, he actually worked as an executive assistant to Boston Mayor Kevin White and for Congressman Michael Harrington. He then served 4 terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, representing Back Bay. And then he was elected to Congress in 1980 by the people of Massachusetts' 4th District, and that includes places as diverse as Newton, New Bedford, Taunton, Fall River, and Foxborough. Now, as chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, he's worked tirelessly on legislation for everything from protecting homeowners from foreclosure to increasing affordable housing, increasing the stock of rental housing, and the like. But he's also, as I think everyone in this audience will know, that he's also very well known for his dedication to civil rights and civil liberties. And he's very well versed in congressional history, constitutional history, legislative procedure, and he's really one of the great titans of Congress. After 30 years in Congress, though, he is still very, very attentive to his constituents, focusing on areas of everything from fisheries to elder rights. He was the subject of a 2005 movie called Let's Get Frank. He has published numerous articles, essays, and op-eds, as well as a book called Speaking Frankly. Are you getting a kind of picture here? He's the only member of Congress whose public remarks have been collected in a book of quotations called Frank Talk, The Wit and Wisdom of Barney Frank. Now he, in preparing for this, said, let's find 1 or 2 of his funnier quotes. Of course, you can't find 1 or 2 funny quotes from Barney. There's just too many. But, he's, for example, said things like, during a debate on the House of Representatives, he said, is blatant hypocrisy a violation of the rules of the House? Many, many more. But the best way to understand Barney Frank is to understand, the Washingtonian magazine once said, his wit and candor have led him to, again, he was the brainiest, funniest, most eloquent, and hardest working member of Congress. If there's anyone that believes in public service, who cares about ordinary working folks, but works awfully hard on the toughest problems facing the country and the world, it's Barney Frank. Please welcome Congressman Barney Frank.
Thank you. Thank you on the very lovely introduction. And I did escort Robert McNamara through the steam tunnels, coming out, by the way, right across the street in the gulch, we used to call it, between Kirkland and Elliott houses. The steam tunnels come out in Elliott House. What the dean graciously omitted to mention is that I was in charge of making sure that that didn't happen. So, yes, I did, kind of like the arsonist who comes and puts out the fire, I did get him out of a mess that I was supposed to have prevented. He was wonderfully gracious about it. I am delighted to have this opportunity to speak here and talk about what's really an extraordinarily important subject. We are in, I think, a period in public policy comparable to the turn of the 20th century and the New Deal in this regard. There's a pattern in economic affairs. Let me say, some of my conservative friends, it's now become, in their effort to find ways to tarnish the Obama administration, they have accused him of being a socialist or leading to socialism. On the floor of the House last week, one of the leaders of the conservative Republicans said, wasn't it ironic that even the socialists in Europe were denouncing him for spending too much? I did point out that, in fact, the socialist leading figure in Europe, Gordon Brown, was on his side, and it was the conservatives in Germany and France who were denouncing him. The response was, oh, well, you're much better at finding socialists than I, and my counter-response was that a blind dart thrower would be better at finding socialists. And this throwing around socialism is an example of the bankruptcy of thought. What we are faced with is, for the third time that I can think of, the need for public policy to step in and help rescue the private market from its own excesses so it can do its job better. There's a recurrent pattern. We're obviously a private sector society, and we depend on the private sector for the creation of wealth. And the innovation in the private sector is very important. At various points, the degree of innovation becomes almost qualitative. And you have this situation. There are new economic phenomena or activities that produce a great deal of value. But because they are new, they are operating in a climate without any rules and any regulations, so they also create harm. And the job of public policy is to come up with a framework of rules and regulations that diminish the abuses while maximizing the value. In the late 19th century, we saw the formation of large industrial enterprises, the trust, without which we would not have been able to spread wealth. Ma and pa, small enterprises weren't going to be able to do it. So they produced a lot of wealth. They also produced a lot of abuses. And Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson spent a good part of their administrations trying to come up with rules that gave us the benefit of these large industrial enterprises, but contained the harm. So you got the antitrust acts, you got the Federal Trade Commission, you ultimately got the Federal Reserve, you got the Food and Drug Administration. That worked well for a while, but of course these large enterprises meant that you needed a finance capitalism, you needed the stock market. You were now well beyond what any small group of individuals could do to finance economic activity. And so the stock market blooms, and it does a lot of good, but it has a pattern of abuse. And much of the Franklin Roosevelt administration is creating entities that give the benefit of a vigorous stock market while diminishing the abuses. By the way, if you want to read about how regulation chokes off enterprise, you get tired of some of the right-wing commentators today, go to the congressional record in the 30s and read what they had to say about the establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission or other legislation back then. And the fact is that what Roosevelt did was to set rules to govern the stock market activity so that we got the benefit and not the harm. We go forward now, maybe 60 years, to the 90s, and there was a new set of economic phenomena. Deceptively simple. I think it really comes down to one central fact, and that's the ability to make loans outside of the banking system and then to take the loans and sell them to other people. The process of securitization. 30 years ago, if you got a mortgage, you got it from a banker who expected you to pay him or her back and frisked you pretty good to make sure you were going to do that. I got to the legislature in 1973, and the community banker said, our motto is know your banker. Two things happened. First of all, large pools of money in the world available now outside of the depositor bank system. Until fairly recently, the only way you were going to accumulate enough money to make all those loans was through a bank, because a lot of depositors gave you the money, and the banks intermediated that. But then, because of international activity, oil, trade, large pools of money became available for loans outside of the banking system. They were not regulated by that, because a major constraint against loans being made irresponsibly is the desire to be repaid. But securitization, technology, and outside the banking regulatory system makes it possible for you to make the loans, sell the loans, and be somewhat less concerned about whether they are repaid. Now, it's interesting. Years ago, the view was that debt was for stodgy people and equity was volatile. We've reversed that. The great volatility has been in debt, because increasingly loans have been made, and the percentage of loans that are made by banks, technical banks, entities that take deposits, are deposit insured and are regulated, the percentage of loans that they make has gone way down. And what's happened is loans are being made by institutions that are lightly, if at all, regulated, and they are then sold 100%. And that, I believe, is the cause of the problem. It was particularly the problem with regard to subprime loans. But our job today is very similar, it seems to me, to what Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson did. I know there's debate about whether Taft did or didn't do it. I'll stay out of that. What Franklin Roosevelt did, namely, preserve innovation. Securitization is a good thing. If a banker makes a loan, or if somebody makes a loan on a mortgage and has to wait for that to be repaid for many years, that money can't be relent. If it is securitized, if the loan is immediately sold, that's money for more lending, so that's a good thing. But not if the loans were bad loans. The key here was, in particular, mortgage loans. This is the central piece, and there's general agreement. It was the making of irresponsible mortgage loans that were the problem. Now, our job, as I said, is to put some rules in place. And I want to stress again, these are pro-market rules. One of the problems we have today is that people don't want to invest because they have been so badly burned. That was one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt did. He put some rules in so it was safe to invest in the stock market. We have a problem today where investors are afraid to invest. You know, we know the story of the child who touches the hot stove and gets burned and learns it's not a good thing to touch the hot stove again. The problem we have today is that people, having touched the hot stove, won't touch the hot stove again, or the sink, the bathtub, or the toilet either. We have to get people a way to differentiate between good and dangerous white porcelain. That's the role of public sector activity, is to give people some assurances. Franklin Roosevelt made the stock market a much safer place in which to invest and a much more efficient place because of it. We want to do the same thing with securitization. Now, my friends on the right are very angry about this because they see correctly coming a wave of increased pro-market regulation. I believe we are talking about regulation that enhances the market, that recognizes the importance of a private market, but helps it function better. But this is ideologically something to which they are very opposed. Some of them, I must tell you, honestly believe that this is a lack of freedom, the road to serfdom, von Mises and Hayek. I got to say, there are a large number of supporters of those views in Congress. Fascinating, however, they are all for free enterprise and keeping the government out of economic activity and not getting involved in this sort of regulation, apparently, except where it comes to agricultural subsidies. And there may be somebody here who knows it, but I don't myself read German and often don't understand it when it is translated into English. But apparently in the works of Hayek and von Mises, there is a footnote somewhere that says, except agriculture, because the greatest hypocrisy in American politics is all these free enterprises. If you notice the president tried to cut subsidies for agriculture, horrors. Let's cut children's lunches instead. But we have this fear that if you do that, it's freedom that's at stake, not just economic efficiency. So now the advocates of deregulation have had things pretty much their way for several decades in America. Certainly with the advent of Ronald Reagan. I was standing at Ronald Reagan's first inaugural, my first year in Congress, when he said, government is not the answer to our problem. Government is the problem. He meant it quite literally. And even Bill Clinton, while he didn't fully agree with that, felt he couldn't confront it head on. In fact, my greatest disagreement with Bill Clinton was when he stood up at a State of the Union address the year after the Republicans took over Congress and said, the era of big government is over. I asked some of his people, when was that? Did I sleep through it? I mean, when was the era of big government in America? Maybe from 1933 to 1935. Certainly nothing I ever remembered. Regulation was on the defensive. As late as 2006, when the Democrats won the election, and I was the chairman in waiting of the Financial Services Committee, I was besieged by people telling me that my job was to deregulate, that Sarbanes-Oxley and other regulations were driving all American business overseas. They were going to go to the United Kingdom, where the Financial Services Authority engaged in light touch regulation. The head of the Financial Services Authority just announced, in case you missed it, quote, the era of light touch regulation is over. It went the way of big government, but it had more of a life before it died. The deregulators had their way, and the consequence is the disaster we now face. And they are fighting very hard to stop us from doing what Franklin Roosevelt did and from doing what Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson did, because it's a major ideological fight. Now, they understand that things are in pretty bad shape. So they have an alternative explanation. That's what I refer to by blaming the victims in the title for the speech, which I only got belatedly, so maybe you didn't know that was the title because it wasn't out in time for the remarks. The argument on the right wing, people now agree that this problem came because more than anything else, too many loans for housing were made to not very rich people who couldn't pay them back. There's general agreement that that was the problem. What happened was, I think another metaphor is to think of this as bullets and guns. Those were the bullets, the bad subprime loans. The guns then were these very sophisticated instruments, collateralized debt obligation derivatives that rocketed them all through the world. But it began with those guns. So they acknowledged that it was subprime loans made to people who couldn't pay for them, who couldn't pay them back, that caused the problem. But their argument is that the people who made those loans, the government made them do it. It's the Geraldine Theory. Some of you will remember Flip Wilson. Flip Wilson was an African-American comedian, very funny, back in the days of a little bit less political sensitivity. And one of his favorite characters, who he was an African-American woman named Geraldine. And when confronted with a misdeed, Geraldine's answer was, the devil made me do it. Well, apparently the devil made them make all these bad loans, the devil being the government in this right-wing cosmology. And the argument is it was the attempt by liberals to help poor people that made them make all these bad loans, and that's what caused the problem. And that's been a powerful enough argument, and because I am one of the leaders in trying to put in the regulation, I get some of the blame for this. I have been the target of a great deal of this. And you expect it. I did have one regret, and my mother, some of you knew, was a wonderful fighter for elderly rights. She passed away a few years ago, and you always miss a parent. But I particularly regretted that she wasn't around to hear Dick Cheney single me out for attack in his last. To use a technical parliamentary term, my mother would have kvelled to hear Dick Cheney attack me. Kvelled being the Yiddish word for taking particular pride in someone. But the argument is that we liberals try to help the poor people. One of the things I want to blame is something called the Community Reinvestment Act. Let me just make one easy statement here. The Community Reinvestment Act, passed in 1977, led by Bill Proxmire, says that if you are a bank and take deposits in a particular area, you got to put some of those deposits back into the area. That's about all it says. It's fairly vague. It applies only to banks, only to technical banks, institutions that take deposit funds and are regulated. If only banks made mortgage loans, there would be no crisis. Overwhelmingly, the loans that were made that caused the problem were made by the non-banks. So blaming this is nonsensical. To their credit, every single regulator of banking in the Bush administration and the Federal Reserve, the control of the currency, the FDIC, has said, nonsense, it's not true. But that's part of their argument. The other one is, and here's where I come into the act, well, we pushed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two the secondary mortgage entities, to do this. Well, the first thing to remember is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac never made a loan. They bought loans that other people made, so they could hardly have been the original source. As to pushing them, here's the problem, and we had this dispute, and it's part of it. Nick Ratsinas is here, and I'll call on Nick for support later. Yes, there's been a dispute between liberals and conservatives over housing, and we have pushed for housing for the poor over their objections, rental housing. What's been too little understood is that it was, on the whole, the conservatives' philosophy that denigrated rental housing. When the Republicans took power in 1995, they systematically dismantled virtually all programs that had been created to help build rental housing for low-income people. Their replacement was to become homeowners. I had a debate with Alphonso Jackson, who had been Secretary of HUD in the Bush administration, in which he told me he wanted to take the Section 8 program, which is rental assistance for poor people, and say that after 5 years in that program, you couldn't get rental assistance anymore. And he said, do you agree with that? I said, well, I would with one condition. I would agree that people should lose their rental assistance after 5 years if you would agree that they wouldn't be poor after 5 years, because then they wouldn't need it. And he said, oh, no, listen, be serious. Why are you opposed to it? I said, Mr. Secretary, if you cut off people's rental assistance after 5 years, what will happen to them? We will make them homeowners, he said. And yes, in 2003, I was quoted as saying that I didn't think Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac faced a crisis. I didn't think Wachovia did then either, or Merrill Lynch, or Bear Stearns, or a number of other institutions. What happened was, and we went back and checked, in 2004, the Bush administration stepped up its effort to get low-income people into home ownership. Great book by Mark Zandi on the fiscal crisis that documents this. At that point, it did become clear we had to do some regulation. So yes, it is true that there was a need to react, but it was because the conservatives killed rental housing, pushed people into home ownership, and rejected Democratic efforts to regulate. Now, I know this is partisan, and let me tell you, yes, it is partisan. First place, I am stunned at the notion that partisan is somehow inherently a bad word. I don't think there's ever been a Democratic polity in the history of the world of any size where you didn't get political parties. Not because somebody decided to do it, but because you need some sort of organization. I mean, partisanship could be excessive, but especially today, the differences between the Democratic and Republican parties on virtually every important issue are quite sharp. There is a real ideological difference. And my one difference with our president, whom I admire enormously, having experienced these people, was when he said during the campaign that he thought he was going to bring in an era of post-partisanship. I understood how deeply right-wing these Republicans were, and I told one of his staff that when he talked about being post-partisan, he gave me post-partisan depression. Because, and you saw it. He tried and he was rebuffed because they weren't interested in this. At any rate, that was the divide. And let me show you the partisan issue. In 1994, the Democrats were in control and passed a bill called the Homeowners Equity Protection Act, which told the Federal Reserve to regulate the granting of all mortgages in the subprime area. Because at that point, it was clear that some of them were being issued outside the banking system. And Alan Greenspan, as he now acknowledged was a mistake, explicitly refused to use the authority. I mean, you can lead a Federal Reserve chairman to authority, but you cannot make him use it. And he refused to use it. And so bad loans were made. That was 1994. During our 12 years when we were in the minority, we tried to get legislation passed to say, okay, if you won't do it, we'll make it a law, and the Republicans stopped us. In 2007, the first year the Democrats were back in power, we did go back to it, and the committee I chair passed a bill in the House, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve did it. By the way, as to who's responsible for the subprime crisis ideologically, when the House passed the bill that I sponsored to stop people from getting loans if they couldn't pay them back, the Wall Street Journal editorially attacked us and said we were creating a Sarbanes-Oxley for housing, and what about all these poor people who weren't going to be able to buy homes? The answer was it's the best thing we could have done for them. And we will be following that up. We will be bringing a bill out in April from our committee that will stop people from getting loans in the future that they cannot repay. And someone said, oh, by the time you're through, the only home loans will be 30-year loans from banks. We said, yes, what was the criticism again? Because that's what used to work. But at any rate, the claim is false. And I do have to say, because we're in a big debate here, the Republicans controlled the Congress from 1995 to 2006 and passed zero legislation to regulate Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, to restrict subprime loans, to do anything else. We are in the process of doing it. So now, our view is that it was, why did people make those bad loans? Because they could. That's the free enterprise system. It doesn't make them bad people. In the free enterprise system, you are supposed to make as much profit as you can without violating the law. There were some law violations. There were some abuses. But if we want to restrain activity, you don't preach, you pass laws. Because, by the way, if you want to restrain activity by preaching, then some people will and some people won't. There's a competitive drive out there. The way in which there's a very brave man named Harry Markopolos who was the first one to blow the whistle on Bernie Madoff. And actually, we were very flattered because he came to Jim Siegel, who's sitting here, worked for me, and said he trusted us to hear the story. He got onto the Madoff thing because he was working for a competitive company, and the company said to him, will you please go find out how the hell he does that? Because we want to do it too. And he came back and said, I know, he makes it up. But that's an example. That's an example of what's going on, the competitive pressures. If you don't have rules, then Gresham's law will work. And the bad will put pressure on the good. And so if you want to, people say, well, how come you're not making more money? I asked Charles Prince, when he was then the CEO of Citicorp, why he was not putting the structured investment vehicles on his balance sheet. He said, because if I do, I'll be at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis Goldman Sachs. So you got to have the rules that make it work. So here's what we plan to do. And I'm going to open this up. Our view is that it was the securitization process, particularly in mortgages, but not only there, in credit cards, in auto loans, in other loans, and the sophisticated way of rattling them through the system, including credit default swaps. Credit default swaps deserve a little attention. They are a wonderful innovation. They are insurance that's not called insurance. You buy homeowners or automobile or life insurance, and a state regulator makes that company show that it's got the money to pay you off, some combination of reserves and reinsurance. Credit default swaps were insurance issued without any reserves whatsoever. The reason is that the people issuing them thought they would never have to pay off because they were issuing them on mortgages and they thought house prices would go up and up and up and up. And so, you say, well, why would people issue all these insurance policies, credit default swaps, insuring other people against a drop in the value of their assets when they didn't have the money to pay for it? It's very simple. Take the analogy of life insurance. They thought they were in the business of selling life insurance on vampires. You could sell life insurance on vampires without worrying. And then the vampires started to die. And that's the problem we've got. So and what happens is bad loans are made, and then they are sent through the system in an unsophisticated way because there are no regulations. There are 4 things we want to do. First, I believe it is important that we say you cannot securitize 100% of anything, that you have to retain some percentage of that, because it turns out our mothers were right. People are not as careful with anybody else's money as they are with their own. And once enough bad loans are made, there is no way to recover. We thought, oh, well, don't worry about it. We have these ways of checking. For instance, we had quantitative models. Nobody knew what the hell they were, literally. They sounded good, though. We had diversification. Yeah, but if enough bad things are there, diversifying just spreads the poison. Then we had a great thing, the rating agencies. The rating agencies were going to protect you from buying bad stuff. So first, the rating agencies gave ridiculously high ratings to garbage. Now, because they are worried about it, they are underrating things. State of California just went to the market, and we're working on trying to help them. What do they pay you, 5%, 6%? 6% on full faith and credit bonds. Let me give you a stock tip. Go buy California bonds. There is no chance that the state of California will default, none whatever, and you get 6%. If you live in California, you get it tax-free. But that's because the rating agencies, having overrated, now are trying to cover themselves by underrating. And they remind me of a great line by one of the great editorial writers of our time, Murray Kempton, with the old New York Post. He said, oh, yes, I'm an editorial writer. Our function is to come down from the hills after the battle is over and shoot the wounded. I think That's what the rating agencies have effectively done. If enough bad loans are made ab initio, there is no way to prevent it from poisoning the system. So we start with restricting securitization, not to the point where it stops. And you know, Roosevelt and Wilson didn't cut off large enterprises with antitrust laws. And FDR didn't shut down the stock market with the SEC. And we can adopt some restriction on 100% securitization that will allow us to continue to get the benefits. Secondly, we have to deal with incentive compensation, the incentives of compensation. The problem with the large compensation to chief executives is not simply the amounts. It is more that they are perverse incentives in their structure. Essentially, they are this. If you are in charge of the company and you take a big risk and it pays off, you make money. And if you take a big risk and it costs the company money, you break even. It's heads they win, tails they break even. If you have a situation where if you take a risk and it pays off, you win, and if it fails, you break even, you will take much too much risk. We had a survey done by actually one of the rating agencies, I'll give them credit on this one, that showed that there was a high correlation between companies that paid their chief executives or top decision makers in incentives and then had subsequently to redo their finances because people would play with the books to do it. So we're going to say that incentives, bonus incentives have defied gravity. They're the one thing that would go up without coming down. It's going to be a two-way street. If you want to pay your decision makers with rewards for risk-taking, then they have to be penalized if the risk costs you money. Third, we need to have a way, and this is very important, to wind down institutions. Wachovia Bank failed, and it was sad, but it was not a cataclysm. But when Lehman Brothers and AIG were in failure, they became cataclysms because we do not have statutory mechanisms using the constitutional power of the bankruptcy code to let someone step in and do them in an orderly way. So when Lehman Brothers, they paid nobody, and AIG, they paid everybody. They have been equally disruptive to the system. So that's the third thing. It's called resolving authority, very euphemistic, but somebody needs to be able to wind those down. And finally, and most importantly, some combination of entities in the federal government have to be in charge of systemic risk. Now, this will not undercut the current requirements that people regulate institutions to make sure they're safe and sound individually. Indeed, we will be talking, I talked to Elizabeth Warren from Harvard Law School just recently about the importance of beefing up the investor/consumer protection parts of what we do. And you know, we used to think, by the way, this is where we were 3 years ago when I came in. What about hedge funds? Oh, don't worry about hedge funds. Here's our protection. We only allow people to invest in hedge funds if they have $1 million to invest. Well, people with hundreds of millions of dollars got badly burned in auction rate securities and swaptions and other sophisticated doohickeys that blew up in their face. So we need to give more protection there. But over and above all that, somebody's got to be, no institution anywhere in the financial system ought to be able to get so indebted that it threatens our stability. We are talking about someone being able to step in and say, sorry, you cannot do this. You're going to have more capital and less leverage. Now, exactly how you do that, we have to work on. But those are the two alternatives. The conservative view is stop trying to help poor people. That's it. Repeal the Community Reinvestment Act. Our view is no. Let's try to help poor people. Let's have regulations in that distinguish between good and bad ways. And let's put into place a series of regulations that will be comparable in impact and scope to what FDR did and to what Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson did. And it's a very intimidating prospect. But I do believe that the result, if we do this right, will be what the result was in 1910 and in 1935, a financial system that works better, that gives us the full benefit of the vigorous private sector mechanisms and diminishes abuses of the kind we've had. We didn't have another Great Depression because we reacted to the Great Depression with Federal Deposit Insurance and the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Investment Company Act. We've kind of run out of the ability to rely wholly on that set of rules. We now need a new set of rules so nobody's going to have to go through 20 and 30 years from now what we're going through now. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Frank. We now have time for questions. There are microphones in 4 locations. One is here, another there, and a final one here. And let me remind those of you that are, or inform those of you that are new to the forum, what the rules are for questions. Questions have 3 characteristics. They start with your identifying yourself. They are short and contain one and only one thought. And the third thing is they end with a question mark. And with that, let's start right here.
Hi, my name is Maeve Hughes, and I just wanted to ask, when you were talking about the difference between renting for poor people, Section 8, versus home ownership, like, why is that such a, I don't know, distinguishing, like, good versus bad idea?
Because, first of all, the conservative notion denigrates renters. The fact is, as a matter of economic reality, a very significant percentage of the people are going to have to rent. They're going to live in areas where they can't afford to own. It is also the case, by the way, for some lower-income people who are living lives of some disorganization for no fault of their own. Home ownership is an added burden. As people who own homes know, it's not the easiest thing to do. But by the way, I am a double renter. I rent in Washington, I rent in Newton. I haven't got the energy to put in home ownership. But the answer is, if people can own a home, that's a good thing. But the conservative view was anti-rental housing and pushed people into home ownership who couldn't afford it. And pushing people into home ownership when they can't afford it does more harm than good. And that's, and as I said, in 2008, at the request of my colleague Keith Ellison, or 2007, new congressman from Minnesota, I went out there to hear about subprime problems, and the advocacy groups put together a panel. And one man said, there were 4 representative witnesses, my wife and I got evicted from our apartment, and we couldn't find a place to rent, so we bought a home. It was then in foreclosure. That's the answer.
Right up here.
Hi, Miles Robinson with the Lyndon LaRouche Political Action Committee, LaRouchePAC.com. Your American Housing Hoax and Foreclosure Prevention Act of 2008, which seems to be a way of brushing off the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act of 2007, has reportedly helped 30 people get out of foreclosure, which I think is as big a failure as Larry Summers' presidency of Harvard. Any comment?
Well, the bill we passed in 2008 was not as helpful as we'd hoped it would be. It had other segments that were very helpful. The particular one about avoiding foreclosure was not, partly because it was still in the midst of a view that we shouldn't do too much. We gave in to conservative pressures, frankly. We had this argument that said, why are you trying to help people avoid foreclosure? I pay my mortgage. Why are you helping them? And the answer is that you try to reduce foreclosures, not primarily as a matter of compassion, but because, in the first place, the collapse of the mortgage system has been at the heart of the macroeconomic problem. The devaluation of assets that's led to this downward cycle began with mortgages that were collapsing. Secondly, foreclosures are very bad for neighborhood. I walked through the city of New Bedford in my district with the mayor of New Bedford and Governor Patrick about a month ago and saw the devastation that occurs to precisely those people paying their mortgages when there is foreclosure. You know, we've got people, because of the economic crisis, laying off firefighters precisely at the time when arson has become an epidemic in some ways because of foreclosure. Finally, it's very bad for the municipalities, the ones where this happens, because property that had been paying taxes now eats taxes. So, but on the other hand, we ran into some political pressure. That's why the House, and I admit that bill was not as well done as it should have been, that piece of it. Other parts of it were very successful, including some very good rental housing pieces. And that's why in 2009, we passed a newer version, which included, somewhat controversially, I supported it then, we didn't have the votes for it. We do now in the House, we're not sure about the Senate, we never are, that would allow people facing a foreclosure to declare bankruptcy. We have an oddity in the law. You can declare bankruptcy and reduce your debt for anything you own except your primary residence. And we are now, we think that will make a major change.
Right up here.
Yeah, Evan Hutchison, Kennedy School, MPA. I just had a question in terms of more the bullet side of this problem. The National Bank Act of 1864 and its interpretation under Marquette National Bank in '78 and Smiley in '96 is kind of a
preemption issue.
Yeah, has allowed essentially any state to violate any other state's, lending or anti-usury laws. And I'm, not familiar with everything that's been going on. But is there any attempt or
Yes.
move towards
Let me
establishing
just
a
explain
federal?
this.
Yeah. Okay.
Under the Constitution, there are three kinds of activities. Some that are inherently federal, like foreign policy and the right to go to war, although some will remember the former governor of New Hampshire, Meldrum Thompson, who tried to get his own nuclear weapons years ago, literally. But some are inherently federal, some are considered entirely local, some are shared jurisdiction. We have recently had a tendency for the federal officials to preempt the right of states to regulate banks. And it came to a head in the Bush administration, although the promulgator of it was a Clinton holdover, a man named Jerry Hawk. And he promulgated a rule that that said that no state could enforce any of its banking regulations against national banks. I tried very hard to get that overturned, but there was no way with Bush as president that we could do that, because he would have vetoed any such bill. But it was upheld by the Supreme Court as a matter of administrative discretion. The court essentially said, look, it's up to the control of the currency. He can do it or not. I am now working, and I mentioned Jim Siegel, my special counsel, is here. We are now convening a negotiating session with the control of the currency, representative of state bank commissioners and state attorneys general, to come up with a plan that will restore power to the states to enforce their own banking laws. And it can be done without a statute. And when I was asked by the Secretary of the Treasury, the incoming Secretary of the Treasury, what I thought about the reappointment of control of the currency, Mr. Dugan, I said yes, subject to that. As far as I was concerned, Mr. Dugan has actually been moderate in using it. So we are now engaged in trying to restore much of that power to the states. We are also going to be passing soon out of our committee a bill that will do some regulation of credit cards. In particular, right now, if you have paid your credit card every month faithfully, or faithlessly, as long as you paid it, you then get into a dispute with some other merchant or some other financial entity, credit card companies will raise the interest rate on your existing balance. We are going to make that illegal. We are also going to deal with the question of payments, late payments. I have told them I am convinced that they watch me, and when I go on vacation, they mail the credit card bill immediately. So I am likely it's not. So we are going to, that's when we're going to do that at the federal level. But we are going to restore significant state power over national banks.
Right over here.
Shaloha. My name is Ari Cole, and I'm an alum from the Kennedy School in 2008. I'm a physician from Honolulu, Hawaii. My question has to do with government and the religious texts, the Torah, the New Testament. When I was at the Kennedy School, we were encouraged to look at religiosity and how government interfaces. At the Divinity School, we looked at the Torah and how law and finance is based out of the Torah, the Old Testament. In Micah number 2, it says that taking possession of, or scheming to take possession of someone's home through schemes is abhorrent to him. And also in the Torah, it says that interest is abhorrent. You as chairman have the ability to write that in subprime loans or interest. Can you make comment on that, please?
Well, sure, but you are familiar, when you asked me to adopt the Torah as binding, you are familiar with all of Leviticus? I got to say, you could look it up, and I'm not just talking about eating shrimp, which I also do, but I do not believe that we should ban interest altogether. By the way, in Islamic societies where they follow the Quran and ban interest, they have come up with something that looks remarkably like interest to me. They just don't call it interest. It's a shared appreciation, and I think the extent to which you do hoop-de-doo, you ought to minimize. But yes, we are going to pass out a subprime bill out of our committee that, as I said, people are complaining, though, by the time you're through, the only mortgages will be 30-year fixed rate. I want to accommodate 15s for people above. What we are trying to do, and this is an example of government, when the Bush administration took power, the Federal Housing Administration, Nick's familiar with, was doing 700,000 applications a year. By 2007, that was down to 200,000, cut by by a third. The FHA guarantees mortgages for people, including lower-income people, after it has made sure that they can make the payments. We are going to restore the FHA. We've already begun to do that and ban people outside. So we are going to ban these abusive mortgages. We are going to severely limit prepayment limitations. We are going to ban those that say, you pay low interest for 2 years, and then it goes up in the third year. So our subprime bill is going to do very much along those lines, but I still will drive on Saturday, I have to admit.
Okay, thank you.
Right over here.
Hi, my name is Justin Ginsberg. I'm a student at the business school. And doing my taxes last weekend, I was reminded once again that renters don't really get much of a break, yet homeowners do. Just wondering if you see any opportunity to create some equity in the tax code for renters or remove the mortgage interest deduction.
No, you're right, I just did mine, and you must be living in the dorm, because if you're doing your Massachusetts taxes, you do, as a Massachusetts renter, get a tax break, which I just got, yes. Federally, you're right, it is. Look, federal policy is very pro-home ownership, and home ownership has been a big deal. We did get a limitation, is it 750,000 on the, $1 million? You cannot deduct your home mortgage interest above that. I believe there is a great deal to be said for adjusting that, but politically it is not going to come from being tougher on homeowners. It would have to come on being somehow nicer to renters. I mean, that's just a political fact of life. I do believe, yes, renters pay that kind of penalty. And on the other hand, by the way, actually, the homeowner's benefit is being somewhat attenuated now in places like Massachusetts in ways that I am committed to trying to undo, and that's because the alternative minimum tax reduces the value, but that particularly hurts high-tax states. So I think that's a bad idea for that reason. But I acknowledge the point. Politically, it is one that is going to be very tough to move. There may be, at some point in the future, some way to help renters. But no, there's no way you're going to get any further reduction in the home mortgage. In fact, President Obama proposed some limitation on deductibility for people in the top brackets, and it is not among the 83 most popular proposals he has made this year.
Right up here.
Hi, my name is Lowell Goshu. I'm an MPP2 here. I'm also president of the Harvard Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Caucus here. This is a question in regards to gay and lesbian citizens as well as people who are part of other marginalized groups. You're the first openly gay man to serve in Congress, and I'm wondering if you have any advice for people who are stigmatized or feel marginalized and discouraged for going into politics.
I appreciate it. First, and it's often misstated, so I don't want to, it isn't critical of you, but I'm the second openly gay man. My colleague, my colleague Gary Studds from Massachusetts was the first to acknowledge being gay. I was second. Since then, we have had the first and second members who were acknowledged being gay before they were elected. I mean, in Gary's case, in my case, as members of Congress, it was essentially surprise, surprise. But in their case, it was, for people, they were elected in districts in which apparently Leviticus was not widely subscribed to. But the answer is this, I think. The country is better than we think. I waited a long time before acknowledging voluntarily that I was gay. I wish I'd done it earlier. I do think that my favorite way to look at the American Constitution, American history, we had this wonderful set of documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that set forward marvelous principles which were only very partially observed in reality. And American history has been a series of efforts to take those extraordinarily radical democratic principles for the 18th century and apply them to groups to whom they did not originally apply. I mean, to some extent, it was to get the full benefit, you had to be a rich white Christian man. And those things have fallen away. And the way to do it, I think, is simply not to be intimidated. Nobody has to be socially, economically, or sort of career-wise suicidal. But I do think that there's an optimistic strain here in American history, that things have gotten better. And it's particularly true generationally. I have seen more of a change in attitudes towards those of us who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, generationally than the other. In fact, I'll tell you, in '93, I fought against the adoption of the policy that excluded then gay and lesbian people from the military. We're going to be able to overturn that next year, I am confident, in part because in '93, people like Sam Nunn and Colin Powell, who are our leading opponents, were able to cite members of the military who were 19 and 20 years old who were appalled at the notion of having gay and lesbian people there. Thanks to the advances in society, that's much less true. So the answer is just keep fighting and be sensible about it. I will say this to marginalized people, though. Part of the fight is political. And I do urge people to resist the temptation to spend all your time making each other feel better. The job is to reach out. And I have one very important, I don't like to be preachy, give young people advice, who cares, but if you are engaged in a very difficult political struggle, and you are engaged in activity that makes you feel really good, it is almost certainly a waste of time, because it means you are with people who agree with you, reinforcing each other. And what you got to do is get out there and talk to the rest.
Right up here.
Thank you for showing up, Arnie. My name is Mark. I'm an independent journalist. I'd like to ask you a question about 9/11.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Journalists are not allowed to ask questions.
Well, I'm an independent journalist, just a regular citizen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead about 9/11.
Senior intelligence officer, Army of the Army, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer has testified before Congress that a program that he worked on, Operation Able Danger, they found 4 of the hijackers before they managed to do their hijacking. And he also testified that 2.5 terabytes worth of data had been destroyed. What can you propose to stop something like this from happening again in order to prevent future attacks from happening in our country?
It is true that we were taken by surprise, and not everything was done in advance that could have been done if you knew this was coming. That is often the case. I believe that we have, in fact, since that time, taken a number of very important steps that will make it much less likely. Look, it's a free society. And a free society, there was always going to be an element of risk. I believe we have diminished that risk substantially. In fact, I disagree with some of the methods that we use, which I think were excessive and not contributing to our safety. I think there was an element of sort of political and even ethnic discrimination that in no way contributed to our help, and in fact might have undermined it, because you want the support of communities with which this will happen. But the answer is, I believe that we have gotten much better. There was not a lot of coordination, for instance, between the FBI and the intelligence agencies. I think the creation of a Director of National Intelligence has been very helpful in not completely eliminating this, but in breaking down those restrictions. And part of the problem was, I believe, that there was not communication among the various law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and I think that's gotten a lot better.
Right over here.
My name's Peter Monkenbeck. I'm a consultant who develops affordable housing in Boston. My question, though, is about the credit default swaps and those insurance-like family of instruments that proliferated during the first part of this century. And I would like to ask you if you could identify, in your view, the relative importance of that. You said what you thought the underlying issue was, but you didn't go on to say, and here's what that did in addition.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And the other question I wanted to ask is, would it be too much to ask for a regulation that said that the only people who could essentially buy the contrary position with respect to a loan are the people who have some skin in the game, and only to the extent of their skin?
Yeah, no, take the last part. That is the concept in insurance, which is that you have to have an insurable interest. I can't insure your life. Not a bad idea when you think about it. I can't insure your car. I can only buy insurance if I have an insurable interest. Credit default swaps were a very glaring objection to that. That is one of the things we should take. As to relative, I'd say it's a case of bullets and guns. The bullets were the bad loans that should not have been made, that were made possible because of large pools of liquidity that were available to people outside of regulated entities and securitization. The guns were the various instruments for shipping around. Now, credit default swaps, of course, were secondary because credit default swaps insured the instruments. I guess they were tertiary. Bad loans are primary. Secondary are the collateralized debt obligation derivatives that sent them to everybody. Credit default swaps then insured them. It sounds like, well, I don't know why she swallowed the fly by the time you're through. The answer is we have to regulate all of them. You prevent a lot of bad loans from being made. You then substantially limit people's ability to indebt themselves beyond what they can pay, and then you limit people's ability to insure those who are indebted themselves. They're all of a piece.
Right over here.
Steve Patterson, local entrepreneur. The question I've got has to do with many of the causes that you brought up, the failures to rate, failures to put liabilities on the books, the quantitative models. All of these, when you come right down to it, in many cases were fraud. And there's been no stomach in the government to prosecute this fraud. And when you look at it and you say there's no stomach there to enforce the law against fraud, then where will be the mandate behind the regulation to enforce the regulation?
You're absolutely right. First of all, again, I have to be partisan. There are Democratic and Republican differences in this. You are now seeing, for instance, a much tougher approach on tax evasion. And there were Democratic and Republican differences. You had under the Republican regime, particularly when George Bush became president, when Sarbanes-Oxley passed in 2002, I had to fight to get the Republican Congress to provide them the funds to enforce it, because they said they would just be harassing people. I also agree very much. In fact, the committee I chair, we had a hearing a month ago in which we had all of the enforcement agencies and the FBI and the state attorneys general to make precisely that point. And I believe you are now going to see more of it. The only thing I would say is this. I am afraid that less of it was against the law than you may think, and that's part of the problem. Too many things weren't against the law, but there were still frauds. Some of it was allowed, some of it was not. I mean, people without insurable interest issuing credit default swaps, people securitizing loans that shouldn't have been in the first place. Many of those were legal. So it is a combination, but it is important that there be prosecutions. And now the FBI has acknowledged, frankly, and part of it was for a while they were focused on terrorism. And we are now trying to get a shift of law enforcement resources back into that area. We ran into the problem before of the national bank preemption, which limited, because to the extent there were some banks involved, state officials weren't able to be there. But the only answer I can give you is I agree with that. That is a unfortunately accurate description of the Bush years. I believe you will see it very different under the Obama administration. I think you will see people who are appointed. In fact, Mary Shapiro, who's the new head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, just brought in as her chief counsel someone from the prosecutor's office in New York who has a reputation for being a tough prosecutor. And I believe you're going to see a lot more of that.
Right up here.
Hi, Denver Attaway is my name, and my question has to do with the foreclosures taking place across the nation, and how much of a link do you see between that and the bankruptcy reform of 2005 that took place?
None, unfortunately, because of this. In 2005, Congress did make it harder to become bankrupt. I voted against it, but I voted against a lot of things that happened during that period. But it did not affect the foreclosures, because prior to that, apparently in the 70s, before I got to Congress, Congress had amended the bankruptcy code entirely to exclude primary residences. So before or after 2005, you could not discharge your mortgage debt on your primary residence by bankruptcy. So the fact that it made it harder to do that had no effect on the foreclosures. We are now trying, and the House has passed a bill that would allow foreclosures, would allow bankruptcy in these cases, and has instructed in our bill the judges to follow the very good model. Secretary Geithner did not get enough credit for a very good plan to try and not only diminish foreclosures, but to provide assistance for people who are not facing foreclosure. Right now, mortgage interest rates are coming down, but if your house price has dropped to the point where your equity is too low, you can't refinance. And one of the very good things that the Geithner plan said was, if you have equity up to 105%, or if your loan is up to 105% of the equity, you can refinance. So that's been very helpful. It uses Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac funds. But the specific answer to your question is that people with a primary residence were not allowed to go into bankruptcy before or after. So the 2005 tightening has had some effects, but not on this.
Thank you.
Right over here.
Yes, Alan Demers. I'm also with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. I'd like to ask why, I'm not quite sure what your reasoning is, but you haven't yet supported the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, which calls for a freezing, a moratorium on
Well, I will tell you.
foreclosures and a bankruptcy reorganization of the entire
Well, I am
banking
for,
system.
I voted against the bankruptcy in 2005. I am for doing bankruptcy, but I will, let me be very clear. The main reason I'm not supporting your plan is I think Lyndon LaRouche is a lunatic. And
Does that mean his plan is wrong?
You know, there's no point in getting deep in the weeds. I do think a rule that said no foreclosures anywhere would be very irresponsible. It would weaken banks. There are people who got mortgages who ought to be paying them.
That's why you
I'm
put
sorry,
banks
the
through
rules are, what?
That's why you put the banks through bankruptcy. You can't have a freezing of all foreclosures without having the banks in bankruptcy.
Right, I don't want to bankrupt every bank in America. One of your mistakes is, which is one of the common mistakes is, look, there are a few very big banks, some of which got in trouble. There also are community banks, local banks, who are the victims of this, who made good mortgages and who are being blamed unfairly. And we want to try and keep their assessments going up. And I'm hoping that tomorrow you'll be reading soon that the mutual savings banks in Massachusetts, which haven't even been able to get money from the TARP program, will, as of tomorrow, be able to get it, because we've been pushing for that. But the answer is, no, there are a lot of very responsible banks that made good mortgage loans to good people, and it doesn't get any better the third time you say it. The fact is that telling everybody in America not to pay his or her mortgage, including a large number of mortgages that were made on responsible terms by good banks, is the kind of lunacy that I expect from Lyndon LaRouche.
My name is Joel Pollack, and I'm a student at the law school. In your account of how the subprime mortgage crisis came about, you mentioned the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, the Republicans in Congress, conservatives. But it happened on your watch, and I would just like to ask you...
When was my watch, sir?
When you became the chairman of the committee.
Which was when?
Which was in 2007, prior to the financial crisis. So what I would like to know is if you acknowledge any responsibility at all for what's happened.
Well, this is the right-wing approach. Yeah, I did become chairman in January of 2007. I became chairman on January 31st, 2007. In March of 2007, March 28th, the committee I chair passed a very tough bill to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It was the bill that the Bush administration wanted that they couldn't get from the Republican Congress. The Republican House passed a bill in 2005. The Bush administration denounced it. So in 2007, I had been chairman for 2 months. You said it happened on my watch. Well, what happened on my watch was 2 months into it, I got the House to pass a bill in May, committee passed it March 28th, to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, the Senate didn't pass it till a year later, but that still meant a bill that the Republicans never passed. They were in charge from 1995 through 2006. I was in the minority. That was not my watch. I was against what they did. Secondly, that was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In January of 2008, I asked the Secretary of the Treasury to take that bill and make it part of the stimulus plan. He was sympathetic, but he was overruled by right-wing ideologues in the Bush administration. Now, then he got the subprime crisis. In 2004, when the Bush administration ordered Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to increase the number of loans they bought for people below the median income, it's a Bloomberg News article I'll give you there. You can check Mark Zandi's book on the financial shock about it. Zandi, who had been an advisor to John McCain, among others. I protested. I said that would be bad for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and bad for the homeowners who would not wind up as homeowners. In 2005, I and 2 other Democratic members of the Financial Services Committee, Mel Watt of North Carolina, Brad Miller of North Carolina, pushed for legislation to restrict subprime lending because Alan Greenspan wouldn't use his authority. Tom DeLay, the Republican leader, vetoed that. Am I responsible when I was in the minority and tried to stop it? No. Now, also in 2007, after we passed the bill to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we passed the bill to restrict subprime abusive lending. The Wall Street Journal, which is one of the entities that propagates the notion that it happened on my watch, denounced me. I go back to the November editorial of the Wall Street Journal, which said, you guys are killing, what about all these people who won't get housing? And the answer was, yeah, they shouldn't have been put in that sort of position. So no, I don't understand what it is you think. I did become chairman in January of 2007. Let me ask you another question. What is it you think I should have done beginning in January 31st of 2007, which is when I became chairman, that I didn't do?
Well, first of all, you pushed a stimulus bill through Congress that included several provisions that you later attacked as profoundly wasteful and so on, like
Who did?
the
Not
AIG
me.
bonuses.
Wait a minute, you were talking about the subprime crisis. That you're talking about a bill in 2008 or 2000?
And in 2008, in October, you accused critics of the stimulus plan of being racist and so on.
No, excuse me.
I'm still waiting for a very
And
simple answer to your
I'm
question.
waiting for you to tell me what you think I should have done. I didn't say they were
You're
racist.
a public representative. I'm a student. I'm asking
Oh, so which allows you to say things that you don't back up.
I'm asking. It does allow me to ask you a question. I'm waiting for you to
Okay.
explain
I've
how
given you
much,
the
if
answer.
any, responsibility do you
Right.
think you?
Well, I will take this. First of all, you are a student. Students are entitled to full constitutional freedom of speech under the First Amendment. You've made an accusation that is wholly inaccurate.
I didn't accuse you of anything. I'm asking how much responsibility,
Sure.
if any. If you can say none, that's fine.
I think you're being disingenuous, to be honest, when you say you haven't made an accusation. You said it happened on my watch. Rarely, I've never heard anybody say, good for you, it happened on your watch. That's accusatory. You're entitled, look, you're entitled to be critical, but I am entitled to answer. The answer is, yes, I do take responsibility for something. In 2006, the Republican-appointed chairman of the SEC, who was forced out by George Bush because he was too much of a regulator, Bill Donaldson, tried to get control of, tried to make hedge funds register. The courts overturned him. They were right because he was bending the statute. He was right on public policy, wrong on the law. I immediately filed the bill in 2006 when I was still in the minority to say hedge funds should be registered. In 2007, I was approached by people who said, no, you can't do too much regulation, and I backed off. I wish I hadn't. But as far as your question that the subprime thing happened on my watch, I think it's fair to you to ask, what is it you think I should have done? You said, well, I was critical of a stimulus bill a year later, but that didn't cause the subprime crisis. My criticism of the stimulus bill, you mean people say, oh my God, he's being critical, let's default. I mean, I don't understand. I mean, the point, excuse me, here's what happened on my watch. I became chairman on January 3rd, and this is the right-wing attack on liberals to try and stop regulation that you are repeating. On January 31st, I became the chairman. On March 28th, the committee passed a very tough Freddie bill, which the Bush administration liked. Later that year in November, we passed a bill to restrict subprime lending. Because we did the subprime lending restriction, Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, did what Alan Greenspan refused to do and said, okay, I'll do that. So I do want to ask you, when you suggest that I should apologize for something or take responsibility, what is it you think I should have done that I didn't do?
Well, after spending the entire speech blaming conservatives, I happen to think of myself as a conservative, and I rent, and I think of myself as someone who cares about poor people. I'm just interested whether you think you have any responsibility.
Well, I've answered the question. Sir, I think you're not being fully honest with us. You clearly are implying that I do. And I'm asking you, I have given you my record. Now, what is it you think I should have done that I didn't do? What are you implying I left undone? It does seem to me a fair question to ask, given the way you asked your question.
Well, for example, I think that instead of using the TARP money to simply roll through AIG and use it to pay out other banks to which it owed other obligations, you could have monitored that before you chose to give them $700 billion.
Well, here's the deal. You're totally wrong on your facts. Congress did not vote to give AIG that money. What happened, again, by the way, that happened in September of 2008, well after the subprime crisis hit us. In September of 2008, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Bernanke, and this is an example of the right-wing's effort, frankly, to try and change the subject from getting regulation.
Stop labeling him. Just answer the question.
I am labeling. I think labels are important, and I think that there is a systematic right-wing attack to try and divert the blame for the deregulation. In September of 2008, Chairman Bernanke of the Federal Reserve came to the Congress and said, didn't ask for advice, informed us that he had decided under a statute that had been passed in 1932 to lend $85 billion to AIG. There was no congressional involvement in that at all. It's at that point that the bonuses had been paid. Federal money, 2 days later, Secretary Paulson of the Bush administration and Chairman Bernanke came and said, if you don't give us authority for $700 billion, there will be terrible problems. We gave them authority for $350 billion with some restrictions. We told them they couldn't spend the second $350 until there was a chance for Congress to vote. But neither of those could arguably have anything to do with cause the subprime crisis. Now, I do believe that statute from 1932 is excessive in the power it gives the Federal Reserve and should be changed. But I don't understand, again, you make a mistake when you say that we allowed the AIG money. It was the chairman of the Federal Reserve who did that on his own and told Congress, didn't ask us.
We have time for 2 more questions. One, if it goes like that, right here.
My name is Ronald Thomas. I am a securities analyst. I followed the financial stocks for approximately 30 years. It's a little bit long-winded question, but I don't think it will have the problem.
Really
In 1990, I was at about 3 months of unemployment. I lived in Washington, D.C. I applied for a job in one of the federal regulatory agencies. It would had something to do with people following bank stocks. I had already called the Texas bank problems in 1982 before they happened, and I had called the real estate problems that led to the 90-91 recession in 1986 when the cash flow was changed via the depreciation law changes.
Question?
Please. Guy came back to me and said, I didn't get a thing for the job. The guy came back to me and said, well, you only follow, I got the guy at the OPM who wouldn't go, and he said, look, he said, you only follow the stocks, you don't follow the companies. In 2005, going forward, at the end of 2005, I would say that every securities analyst in this town knew there was going to be a major train wreck with subprime, but nobody knew it. And I'm saying, going forward, when this mess is all over, how are you going to ensure that the generally inept federal government doesn't have another train wreck with subprime commodities funds in 2016?
I can answer you directly, and I ask you to get Mark Zandi's book called Financial Shock, a very good bipartisan guy. It is not true that no one saw it coming. In 2005, as he notes in the book, I and 2 North Carolina congressmen who were working with a very good group called the Committee for Responsible Lending. First of all, Ned Gramlich, who'd been a member of the Federal Reserve Board, talked to Alan Greenspan and said, you have authority that was given to you, use it. Greenspan flatly refused. He said, that's regulation. Knowing that Greenspan wouldn't do it, in 2005, the year you were talking about, we began pushing for legislation to restrict subprime lending. So it's wrong to say no one saw it coming. Unfortunately, the Republicans were in power. Tom DeLay sent orders to the Financial Services Committee, stop that. So again, I have to rebut your premise. We did see this coming in 2005. We did try to stop it, and we were stopped because of Alan Greenspan and Tom DeLay's view that regulation was a bad thing.
This will have to be the last question right there.
Hi, my name is Aaron Goldstein, and my question concerns executive compensation. If the bonuses to AIG executives were so egregious, why was it that you and your colleagues in Congress supported an amendment protecting the said bonuses in the Recovery and Reinvestment Act?
Because the bill was passed in too much of a hurry, and to deal with that, and somebody didn't give you this part of the information, a bill that I brought out of the committee I chair, which passed the House last Wednesday, would undo that amendment. So the answer is this. Yeah, we passed the recovery bill. You may know it as the stimulus bill, but the people in charge of message have told us that we're not supposed to call it the stimulus bill. We're supposed to call it the recovery bill. My own experience is that most people preferred to be stimulated than to recover, so I did not understand why that was the language, but it is the recovery bill. And in the recovery bill, here was the problem. There was a need to do it quickly. I agree with that. Unfortunately, we had a 2-week recess coming around Washington's birthday. There was a strong commitment on the part of the president to getting it done and getting the money into the economy before the recess. In the hurry, language was included that shouldn't have been. That sometimes happens. That's why we have what are called technical corrections bills. Chris Dodd, to his credit, initiated new restrictions. He ran into resistance from people who said, okay, we'll take your new restrictions going forward, but exempt these others. By the way, if he hadn't put that provision at all, we'd have been in the same situation we're now, worse, because we wouldn't have had anything going forward. The amendment was adopted without most people knowing it, that limited it to being prospective. When we returned, I thought it would be a good idea to undo that anti-retroactive piece. So in last Wednesday, the House voted to pass a bill that undoes that. Now, you can say it's too late, but it's not too late, because we're dealing with things that were retroactive. So the fact that it had been originally passed and said okay, and then undone, it is as forceful now as it would have been then. So the answer is, and this is again something where, Frank, I think the right wing's being very inconsistent, they would rather complain about it than fix it. Because when we brought the bill to the floor that would undo the provision you talk about, almost no Republican voted for it. The Republicans voted against it. So what I'm hoping is that the Senate will now pass that bill. By the way, you may have read that there were bonuses about to be paid as retention bonuses to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The bill we passed on Wednesday, over the objection of almost all the Republicans, would prevent those from happening. So the answer is, how did it happen? It happened because we were legislating too hurriedly, but fortunately this was a reparable mistake, and the House passed a bill last week under my committee's jurisdiction to undo that mistake over the objection of the Republicans, who I think, frankly, have developed a deep affection for this grievance and are determined not to lose it.
Thank you very much, Barney. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Have a safe journey home.